The screaming started before anyone understood what they were seeing. Marcus Rodriguez's body hit the arena dirt with a sound that cut through the cheers like a gunshot. The 1,500-pound bull named Devil's Canyon had just thrown him 8 feet into the air, and as Marcus fell, his left leg twisted at an angle that made every person in the Uvalde County Fairgrounds gasp in horror. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. Devil's Canyon, instead of running toward the exit gate as bulls typically do after a successful buck-off, turned with a speed that defied his massive size. His black eyes fixed on the motionless rider, and 1,800 pounds of pure muscle and fury charged directly at Marcus's crumpled form. "Get up! Get up!" screamed Carmen Delgado from the bleachers, her voice joining a chorus of terrified shouts from the crowd. But Marcus wasn't moving. His helmet had come off during the fall, and blood was already pooling in the dirt beneath his head. Tommy Bull Jackson, the pickup rider and rodeo clown, was sprinting across the arena, but he was 40 feet away and running on a bad knee. Dr. James Mitchell was already vaulting over the barrier, his medical bag forgotten as he ran toward the center of the arena. But they were all too far away, and Devil's Canyon was closing the distance with each thunderous step. Sarah Thompson, the event coordinator, stood frozen at her position near the announcer's booth. In 20 years of organizing rodeos, she had never seen a bull behave like this. They bucked, they ran, sometimes they kicked, but they didn't hunt. This animal was hunting, and 3,800 spectators were about to witness something that would haunt Uvalde for generations. Chuck Williams, the veteran announcer, had gone silent. His microphone hung useless in his hand as he watched the scene unfold below. The usual soundtrack of country music had stopped, and the only sounds in the arena were the pounding of hooves, the desperate shouts of would-be rescuers, and the collective intake of breath from a crowd that was realizing they were about to see something terrible. But then, in a moment that would be replayed on news stations across Texas for weeks to come, something extraordinary happened. Bill Hoffman, the 54-year-old stock contractor, appeared as if from nowhere. He had climbed over the chute gate and was running directly into the path of his own bull, waving his arms and shouting at the top of his lungs. "Hey! Hey! Over here, you son of a bitch!" Devil's Canyon, just 15 feet from Marcus's unconscious form, skidded to a halt and wheeled around to face this new threat. Hoffman, a man who had worked with bulls for over 20 years, understood their psychology better than anyone in the arena. Bulls were predators, but they were also intelligent. They responded to confidence, to aggression, to someone willing to meet them on their own terms. "That's right, big boy. I'm the one you want. Come on." The bull charged, but now Tommy Jackson had reached Marcus and was dragging him toward the arena fence. Dr. Mitchell arrived seconds later, immediately checking for a pulse while keeping one eye on the drama unfolding 20 feet away. Hoffman, despite his years of experience, had made a fatal miscalculation. As Devil's Canyon bore down on him, the contractor tried to dodge to his left, but the bull anticipated the move. The massive animal's shoulder caught Hoffman in the ribs, sending him cartwheeling through the air before he crashed into the arena fence with a sickening crack. The crowd's screams reached a new pitch. Parents were covering their children's eyes, and several people in the front rows had started vomiting. Elena Vasquez, the reporter from San Antonio, was frantically scribbling notes while trying to process what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a rodeo accident. This was a catastrophe unfolding in real time. Dr. Mitchell, still kneeling beside Marcus, shouted over the chaos, "I need paramedics. Now!" This boy's got a severe head injury and possible internal bleeding. But the paramedics were already dealing with their own crisis. Bill Hoffman wasn't moving, and the impact with the fence had left him in a position that suggested multiple fractures. Devil's Canyon, meanwhile, had finally been corralled by 3 other pickup riders who had entered the arena, but the damage was already done. Sarah Thompson's hands were shaking as she grabbed her radio. "This is Control. We have multiple injuries in the main arena. I need all available medical personnel, and I need to halt the competition immediately." The voice that came back was Chuck Williams, the announcer, who had finally found his composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're suspending tonight's competition. Please remain in your seats and allow our medical personnel to do their work. Folks, what we've witnessed here tonight, this is not typical rodeo action. This is something none of us were prepared for." In the Rodriguez family section, Maria Rodriguez had collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Roberto's face was ashen as he watched paramedics working on his son. Around them, other families sat in stunned silence, many of them crying, all of them trying to process what they had just seen. Carmen Delgado had somehow made it from the bleachers to the arena fence, where a security guard was preventing her from climbing over. "That's my boyfriend," she screamed. "I'm a nursing student. I can help." Dr. Mitchell looked up from his work and nodded to the guard. "Let her through. I need all the help I can get." As Carmen dropped to her knees beside Marcus, Dr. Mitchell was already assessing the damage. Severe concussion, possible skull fracture, and his left leg is definitely broken. But he's breathing, and his pulse is steady. That's something. 20 feet away, Bill Hoffman was in much worse condition. The impact with the fence had crushed several ribs, and one of them had punctured his lung. The pickup riders who had finally contained Devil's Canyon were now standing guard over his unconscious form, their faces grim with the realization that they might have just witnessed a man die trying to save someone else's life. Elena Vasquez was moving through the crowd now, interviewing spectators who were still in shock. "I've been coming to this rodeo for 15 years, said one elderly woman, her voice trembling. "I've never seen anything like this. That bull, it was like it wanted to kill someone." "My kids were asking me why everyone was screaming," said another parent. "How do you explain something like this to a 7-year-old? How do you tell them that sometimes the games adults play turn into nightmares?" The paramedics had arrived in force now, 3 ambulances and a helicopter that was preparing to land in the parking lot. The decision had been made to airlift both Marcus and Bill to University Hospital in San Antonio, where trauma surgeons would determine whether they would survive the night. As Marcus was loaded onto a stretcher, he briefly regained consciousness. His eyes found Carmen's face, and he tried to speak, but only blood came out. Carmen gripped his hand and whispered, "Don't try to talk, baby. Just hold on. Just hold on for me." Dr. Mitchell was coordinating with the flight paramedics when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Devil's Canyon, now secured in a holding pen, was still agitated. But more concerning was the behavior of the other bulls in the chutes. They were restless, agitated in a way that suggested something was seriously wrong. "Sarah," he called out to the event coordinator. "We need to get everyone out of here. Something's not right with these animals." Sarah Thompson, who was still trying to coordinate the medical response, looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean these bulls are behaving abnormally. Not just Devil's Canyon, all of them. I've been around livestock my whole life, and I've never seen anything like this. We need to evacuate the grounds." But even as Dr. Mitchell was speaking, the situation was deteriorating further. In chute number 3, a bull named Thunderstorm was throwing himself against the gate with such violence that the metal was beginning to buckle. The other animals were following suit, and the sound of crashing metal and enraged bellowing was adding to the chaos. Tommy Jackson, despite his injured knee, was trying to help calm the animals, but even his experience was inadequate for what they were dealing with. "These bulls are acting like they're on something," he called out to Dr. Mitchell. "I've never seen stock this aggressive." The realization hit everyone at the same time. This wasn't just a freak accident or an isolated incident of animal aggression. Something had affected all of the bulls, something that had turned what should have been an evening of entertainment into a potential massacre. As the helicopter lifted off with Marcus and Bill aboard, the remaining crowd was finally beginning to understand that their night of family fun had become something much darker. Parents were gathering their children and heading for the exits, many of them in tears, all of them carrying memories that would forever change how they felt about this quintessential Texas tradition. Sarah Thompson stood in the center of the empty arena, surrounded by blood-stained dirt and broken dreams, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again in Uvalde. The first light of dawn revealed the full extent of what had happened at the Uvalde County Fairgrounds. Yellow crime scene tape now surrounded the main arena, and investigators from the Texas Department of Public Safety were methodically photographing every inch of ground where the tragedy had unfolded 12 hours earlier. Detective Rita Hernandez had arrived at 4 in the morning, called in from the Austin office because local law enforcement lacked experience with incidents of this magnitude. At 38, she had investigated everything from domestic disputes to drug cartels, but she had never seen anything quite like this. The preliminary reports suggested that something had systematically affected the behavior of 12 bulls, turning them from athletes into weapons. "What do we know about the victims?" she asked Sheriff Mike Patterson, a 20-year veteran of Uvalde County law enforcement who looked like he had aged a decade overnight. "Marcus Rodriguez, 24, bull rider from right here in town. He's at University Hospital in San Antonio, critical but stable. Traumatic brain injury, broken leg, internal bleeding." The doctors say if it wasn't for Bill Hoffman's intervention, the boy would be dead. Patterson paused, looking out at the arena where chalk outlines still marked where bodies had fallen. Hoffman didn't make it through the night. Died at 3:47 a.m. from complications related to massive internal injuries. He saved that kid's life, but it cost him his own. Detective Hernandez made notes in her tablet, but her mind was already working through the possibilities. Any witnesses report unusual behavior from the animals before the incident? That's where it gets interesting, Patterson replied, handing her a stack of witness statements. Dr. James Mitchell, he's been the rodeo doctor here for over 20 years, says he's never seen bulls act like this. Described them as systematically aggressive, rather than just spooked or angry. Sarah Thompson appeared at the entrance to the arena, her eyes red from a sleepless night of phone calls with insurance companies, lawyers, and traumatized families. As the event coordinator, she was facing not just the emotional devastation of what had happened, but the very real possibility that her career was over and lawsuits would follow. Detective Hernandez? I'm Sarah Thompson. I organized this event, and I'll cooperate with your investigation in any way I can. I appreciate that, Mrs. Thompson. I need to understand the normal procedures for animal handling at these events. Who was responsible for the care and feeding of the bulls? Sarah consulted her clipboard, though her hands were still shaking. Bill Hoffman's company, Lone Star Livestock. He's been our stock contractor for 8 years, never had a single serious incident. Bill personally supervised the feeding and care of every animal. When were the animals last fed and what did they eat? Standard procedure is to feed them yesterday afternoon around 4 p.m. High-quality hay, some grain supplement, and plenty of water. Bill was very particular about their diet, said it affected their performance. Detective Hernandez exchanged glances with Sheriff Patterson. Who else had access to the animals between feeding time and the start of the competition? Just Bill's crew. Maybe 4 or 5 guys who've been working with him for years. And Tommy Jackson, our pickup rider and clown, but he's been around these animals for decades. Elena Vasquez arrived at the fairgrounds as the morning investigation was getting underway. The reporter had spent the night in a motel room, calling her editor and trying to process what she had witnessed. Now, in the harsh light of day, the scene looked even more surreal. What had been a place of celebration 12 hours ago now looked like a war zone. Detective, I'm Elena Vasquez with the San Antonio Express News. I was here last night covering the rodeo when everything happened. I'd like to help with the investigation if I can. Hernandez looked up from her notes. You were a witness to the events? I saw everything. I was interviewing Dr. Mitchell about rodeo safety when Marcus Rodriguez was thrown. I saw Bill Hoffman's heroic action, and I noticed the strange behavior of the other bulls in the chutes. Strange how? Elena pulled out her own notepad, filled with observations she had made throughout the night. They were unusually agitated before the incident. Not just normal pre-competition energy, but something more intense. And after Marcus was attacked, several of them tried to break out of their chutes. I've covered rodeos before, and I've never seen anything like it. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the fairgrounds around 8 a.m., having spent the night at the hospital monitoring Marcus Rodriguez's condition. The veteran physician looked exhausted, but he was carrying a folder that he handed directly to Detective Hernandez. I've been thinking about this all night, and I've consulted with some colleagues in veterinary medicine. What we witnessed last night wasn't normal animal behavior, even for bulls under stress. What are you suggesting, doctor? I think the animals were drugged. Something that increased their aggression while decreasing their normal flight response. Bulls typically want to get away from humans after they've bucked their rider. They don't hunt, and they don't systematically attack. But last night, it was like they had been programmed to kill. Detective Hernandez felt the first pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. What kind of substance could cause that kind of behavioral change? There are several possibilities. Certain stimulants could increase aggression. Some hallucinogens could affect their perception of threats. But the most likely candidate would be a synthetic compound designed specifically to alter animal behavior. Sheriff Patterson looked confused. Who would have access to something like that? And why would someone want to turn bulls into killers? Those are the questions we need to answer, Hernandez replied. But first, I need to examine the animals. The veterinary examination of the surviving bulls took place in a secure facility 30 miles from Uvalde. Dr. Angela Santos, a specialist in large animal medicine from Texas A&M University, had agreed to assist with the investigation. What she found confirmed Dr. Mitchell's suspicions and opened up a much darker investigation. All 12 animals show signs of having ingested a synthetic compound that I've never encountered before, Dr. Santos reported after completing her examinations. It appears to be some kind of engineered drug that specifically targets the neural pathways controlling aggression and fear response. Detective Hernandez was taking detailed notes. Is this something that could be obtained commercially? Absolutely not. This is clearly a research-grade compound, probably developed in a laboratory with significant resources. We're talking about something that would require advanced knowledge of animal neurochemistry and access to sophisticated manufacturing equipment. How is it administered? Most likely mixed with their feed. The compound would be tasteless and odorless, so the animals wouldn't detect it. Based on the concentration in their blood, I'd estimate they were given the drug approximately 2 to 3 hours before the competition began. Elena Vasquez, who had been permitted to observe the veterinary examination as part of her reporting, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Doctor, could a person with the right knowledge have predicted exactly what would happen to these animals? Dr. Santos looked grim. If someone had access to this compound and understood its effects, they would have known that the bulls would become systematically aggressive toward any perceived threat. In a rodeo setting, that means they would attack riders who fell, spectators who moved too quickly, and anyone who tried to intervene. The implications were staggering. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident was beginning to look like something much more sinister. A deliberate act of sabotage that had resulted in 1 death and multiple injuries. Detective Hernandez was coordinating with federal authorities now, as the sophistication of the drug suggested connections that went well beyond local criminal activity. The FBI's Biocrimes Unit was sending specialists from Dallas, and the Drug Enforcement Administration was investigating possible connections to illegal pharmaceutical operations. But even as the investigation expanded, the human cost of what had happened was becoming clearer. Marcus Rodriguez remained in intensive care, his family maintaining a vigil that had already lasted 18 hours. Bill Hoffman's widow was planning a funeral for a man who had died trying to save someone else's child. And throughout Uvalde, families were struggling to explain to their children what they had witnessed. Carmen Delgado hadn't left Marcus's hospital room since the night before. The nursing student was using every bit of her medical training to understand his condition, while fighting her own emotional trauma from watching the man she loved nearly die in front of 3,000 people. The neurosurgeon says the swelling in his brain is going down, she reported to Marcus's parents during one of their brief visits to the ICU. He's responding to stimuli, which is a good sign. But we won't know about long-term effects until he fully regains consciousness. Maria Rodriguez clutched her rosary beads, the same ones she had held during every one of her son's rides. I keep thinking about Bill Hoffman. He didn't even know Marcus, but he ran into danger to save him. What kind of world is it where a man dies trying to protect someone else's child from animals that were turned into monsters? Roberto Rodriguez looked older than his 52 years as he processed everything that had happened. I should have stopped him from riding. I should have known something was wrong. 25 years I've been around bulls, and I've never seen anything like what happened last night. Back in Uvalde, the community was struggling to come to terms with the tragedy. The local newspaper had printed a special edition with Elena Vasquez's eyewitness account, and the story was spreading across social media faster than anyone could control it. Videos taken by spectators were going viral, despite the efforts of many witnesses to protect the privacy of the victims. Sarah Thompson was meeting with lawyers and insurance investigators, trying to determine the legal and financial implications of what had happened. The CPRA, Cowboy's Professional Rodeo Association, had suspended all competitions pending the investigation, and similar events across Texas were reviewing their security and animal handling procedures. We're looking at wrongful death lawsuits, personal injury claims, and possibly criminal charges depending on what the investigation reveals, her attorney explained. If someone deliberately sabotaged this event, you could be facing millions in damages. But for Sarah, the legal and financial implications were secondary to the human cost. She had organized this rodeo as a celebration of Texas culture and community tradition. Instead, she had created the conditions for a tragedy that would haunt Uvalde for years to come. Tommy Jackson, the veteran rodeo clown and pickup rider, was having his own crisis of conscience. Despite his injured knee, he had tried to reach Marcus Rodriguez in time to prevent the attack. His failure to arrive quickly enough was eating at him, even though everyone else recognized that his efforts, along with those of Dr. Mitchell and Bill Hoffman, had prevented an even greater catastrophe. "I keep playing it back in my head," he told his wife over coffee in their kitchen as the sun rose over Uvalde. "If I'd been positioned differently, if I'd moved faster, if I'd seen the bull turn back toward Marcus a second sooner." "Tommy Jackson, you listened to me," his wife replied firmly. "You did everything you could. That bull was acting like no bull ever acts, and you can't blame yourself for not being prepared for the impossible." But Tommy wasn't convinced. In his 20 years as a rodeo clown, his job had been to protect riders from exactly this kind of situation. The fact that someone had apparently engineered the attack didn't absolve him of the responsibility he felt for Marcus Rodriguez's injuries and Bill Hoffman's death. As Detective Hernandez continued her investigation, she was building a picture of a sophisticated operation that had specifically targeted the Uvalde Rodeo. The drug used on the bulls wasn't something that could be obtained easily or used without considerable expertise. Someone with advanced knowledge of animal behavior and access to research-grade compounds had deliberately turned a community celebration into a nightmare. The question that haunted everyone involved was why. What could anyone hope to gain from turning bulls into killers at a small-town Texas rodeo? The answer to that question would determine whether what happened in Uvalde was an isolated incident or the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying. 3 days after the tragedy, Detective Hernandez was staring at a wall covered with photographs, timelines, and connection charts in the makeshift command center she had established at the Uvalde Sheriff's Department. The FBI's Biocrimes Unit had arrived from Dallas, bringing with them advanced laboratory equipment and expertise in criminal uses of pharmaceutical compounds. Special Agent David Chun, a specialist in biotechnology crimes, was reviewing the preliminary lab results when he made a discovery that changed everything about the investigation. "The compound used on the bulls isn't just sophisticated, it's proprietary," he announced to the assembled investigators. "We've run it through every database we have, and there's only one facility in North America that has published research on this specific molecular structure." Detective Hernandez looked up from her notes. "Where?" "Biodyne Research Corporation, just outside of Houston. They've been developing behavioral modification compounds for the Department of Defense, ostensibly for controlling aggressive animals in combat zones." Sheriff Patterson whistled low. "So we're talking about military-grade drugs designed to turn animals into weapons." "That's exactly what we're talking about. And here's the interesting part. Biodyne reported a break-in 6 weeks ago. Several vials of experimental compounds were stolen, along with research files that would have explained their effects and usage." Elena Vesquez, who had been granted unusual access to the investigation due to her eyewitness status and journalistic credentials, was taking detailed notes. "Are you saying someone stole military weapons research and used it to attack a small-town rodeo?" "That's what the evidence suggests," Agent Chin replied. "But we still don't have a motive. Uvalde isn't exactly a high-profile target, and a rodeo seems like an odd choice for testing stolen biological weapons." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Carmen Delgado, who was splitting her time between Marcus's hospital bedside and her classes at Southwest Texas Junior College, remembered something that hadn't seemed important until now. "There was a man at the rodeo that night who seemed out of place," she told Detective Hernandez during a phone call from the hospital. "Marcus pointed him out to me before his ride. Said he'd never seen the guy before, but he was asking a lot of questions about the bulls and when they were fed." "Can you describe him?" "Middle-aged, maybe 45 or 50. Wearing new boots and a hat that looked like it had never been worn before. But what was weird was he had a notebook and was writing down everything the cowboys told him about the animals." Detective Hernandez was already reaching for her keys. "Carmen, I need you to look at some photographs. Can you meet me at the hospital in an hour?" The photo identification session took place in a conference room at University Hospital while Marcus Rodriguez continued his recovery in the ICU nearby. Carmen studied the array of photographs that Detective Hernandez had assembled from various sources, including employee records from Biodyne Research Corporation. "That's him," she said without hesitation, pointing to a photograph of Dr. Raymond Miller, a former Biodyne researcher who had been terminated 3 months earlier. "That's the man who was asking questions about the bulls." Agent Chin was on the phone with Biodyne's security department within minutes. The information he received painted a disturbing picture of a brilliant scientist who had become increasingly unstable after his wife's death in a car accident the previous year. Dr. Miller was our lead researcher on the Animal Behavioral Modification Project, explained Dr. Rebecca Walsh, Biodyne's director of research, during a conference call with the investigators. He was doing groundbreaking work, but after his wife's death, he became obsessed with the idea that the compounds could be used to exact revenge on people who he felt had wronged him. What kind of revenge? Detective Hernandez asked. He started talking about how the research could be used to turn celebrations into tragedies, to make people understand what it felt like to lose someone they loved in what should have been a safe environment. We had to let him go because his behavior was becoming erratic and potentially dangerous. The pieces were falling into place now. Dr. Raymond Miller's wife, Janet, had been killed by a drunk driver leaving a rodeo in Kingsville 8 months earlier. The driver, a 22-year-old college student named Kevin Walsh, had been sentenced to only 3 years in prison due to his clean record and the testimony of character witnesses who described him as a good kid who made a terrible mistake. He blamed the entire rodeo culture for his wife's death, Dr. Walsh continued. Said that rodeos promoted drinking and reckless behavior, and that the community protected people like Kevin Walsh because they were part of the Good Old Boys network. Elena Vasquez was putting together a timeline in her notebook. So he stole the compounds from Biodyne 6 weeks ago, spent time researching rodeo schedules and procedures, and chose Uvalde as his target for revenge against the entire rodeo community. It appears that way, Agent Chen agreed. Uvalde would have been an ideal target from his perspective. Small enough that security would be minimal, traditional enough to represent everything he hated about rodeo culture, and close enough to San Antonio to guarantee media coverage. The manhunt for Dr. Raymond Miller was coordinated across 3 states, but it ended anticlimactically at a motel in Corpus Christi where he had been staying under a false name. When FBI agents knocked on his door, they found him sitting calmly at a desk, writing what appeared to be a detailed confession. "I wanted them to feel what I felt," he said as he was arrested without resistance. "I wanted them to watch someone they loved being destroyed by something that was supposed to be safe and fun." Janet went to that rodeo in Kingsville to support her nephew, and she died because some drunk cowboy couldn't handle his liquor. Dr. Miller's confession revealed the full scope of his plan and the depth of his preparation. He had spent months studying rodeo culture, learning about animal behavior, and planning an attack that would maximize both physical and psychological damage to the community. He chose bulls because they're the most dangerous animals in rodeo, and he timed the drug administration to ensure maximum effect during the most crowded part of the evening, Agent Chen explained to the assembled investigators. He wanted to create a situation where families would watch their loved ones being attacked by animals they trusted. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a brilliant man destroyed by grief, and a desire for revenge that had consumed his rational thinking. Dr. Miller had lost his wife in a senseless accident, and in his mind, the entire rodeo community was responsible for creating the conditions that led to her death. Back in Uvalde, the community was struggling to process the revelation that their tragedy had been deliberately orchestrated by someone seeking revenge for his own loss. The randomness of the attack made it somehow worse. They hadn't been targeted because of anything they had done, but simply because they represented a culture that Dr. Miller blamed for his wife's death. Sarah Thompson was meeting with a trauma counselor who had been brought in to help the event staff cope with the aftermath of the attack. "I keep thinking about all the families who were there that night," she said through tears. "Children who will never feel safe at a rodeo again, parents who can't stop seeing what happened to Marcus and Bill. Trauma like this affects entire communities," the counselor explained. "What you're experiencing is a form of collective grief, and it's going to take time for everyone to heal. The fact that this was a deliberate attack makes it even more difficult to process." Marcus Rodriguez regained full consciousness on the 4th day after the attack, and his first words were about Bill Hoffman. "Did he make it?" he asked Carmen, though he could read the answer in her expression before she spoke. "No, baby. He didn't make it. But Marcus, he saved your life. If he hadn't distracted that bull, you wouldn't be here talking to me right now." Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing the information and trying to remember exactly what had happened in those crucial seconds. "I want to meet his family," he said finally. "I want to thank them." The meeting between Marcus Rodriguez and Bill Hoffman's widow took place a week later in the hospital cafeteria. Mary Hoffman, a 60-year-old woman who had been married to the stock contractor for 32 years, had driven up from Kingsville to see the young man her husband had died protecting. "Bill always said that rodeo was about taking care of each other," she told Marcus as they sat across from each other at a small table. Cowboys, stock contractors, pickup riders, clowns, we're all one big family, and family protects family. He did what any good cowboy would do. Marcus, still wearing a bandage on his head and moving slowly due to his injuries, struggled to find adequate words. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for what your husband did. I know it doesn't bring him back, but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his sacrifice. Mary Hoffman reached across the table and took his hand. Honey, you don't owe me anything. You just get better and live a good life. That's what Bill would want. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Mitchell, who had been checking on Marcus's progress throughout his recovery. The veteran physician looked tired but relieved as he reviewed Marcus's latest test results. The swelling in your brain has gone down significantly, and your cognitive functions appear to be intact, he reported. You're going to have some ongoing issues with balance and coordination, and that leg is going to take months to heal properly, but you're going to make a full recovery. What about riding? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Dr. Mitchell exchanged glances with Carmen before responding. That's going to be up to you, son. Physically, there's no reason you couldn't return to competition eventually. But after what you've been through, you might want to consider whether that's what you really want. The question of whether Marcus would ever ride bulls again was complicated by more than just his physical injuries. The psychological trauma of the attack, combined with the knowledge that it had been deliberately orchestrated, had affected his relationship with the sport that had defined his adult life. I keep having nightmares about Devil's Canyon, he confided to Carmen during one of their conversations in his hospital room. But in the dreams, it's not just one bull, it's all of them, and they're all hunting me. Carmen, who had been accepted into a nursing program at UT San Antonio starting in the fall, was facing her own difficult decisions about the future. Maybe it's time for both of us to think about doing something different, she said gently. There's nothing wrong with admitting that what happened changed us. Elena Vasquez's reporting on the Uvalde Rodeo attack had garnered national attention, earning her a Pulitzer Prize nomination for investigative journalism. But the recognition felt hollow given the human cost of the story she had covered. I've been a journalist for 8 years, and I've never struggled with a story like this one, she told her editor during a debriefing at the San Antonio Express-News. Usually when you uncover the truth about something, it provides some sense of closure or justice. But knowing that Dr. Miller planned this attack doesn't make Bill Hoffman any less dead or Marcus Rodriguez any less traumatized. The trial of Dr. Raymond Miller became a media sensation, with reporters from across the country descending on the federal courthouse in San Antonio to cover the proceedings. Miller pleaded guilty to charges of domestic terrorism, murder, and assault with a deadly weapon, accepting a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he was allowed to make a statement that revealed the depth of his mental deterioration and the twisted logic that had led to the attack. I wanted you to understand what it feels like to lose someone in a place where you should feel safe, he said, looking directly at the Rodriguez family and Mary Hoffman. I wanted you to know what it's like to watch a celebration turn into a nightmare because someone made a selfish decision. Judge Patricia Gonzalez, who had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her 20-year career, struggled to maintain her composure as she delivered the sentence. Dr. Miller, I understand that you were devastated by the loss of your wife, and I cannot imagine the grief you experienced. But your response to that tragedy was to create additional tragedies for innocent families who had nothing to do with your loss. You turned your expertise and knowledge into weapons against a community that was simply trying to celebrate their heritage. As the trial concluded and Dr. Miller was led away to begin serving his life sentence, the people of Uvalde were left to grapple with the long-term effects of his actions. The rodeo grounds remained closed, and there was serious discussion about whether the annual event would ever resume. But even as the community struggled with the aftermath of the attack, there were signs of resilience and healing that suggested the spirit that had made the Uvalde Rodeo a tradition for over 50 years had not been completely destroyed. 6 months after the attack, the empty grandstands at the Uvalde County Fairgrounds stood as a stark reminder of how quickly a community's traditions could be shattered. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the arena dirt, and the once cheerful carnival midway was now nothing more than empty concrete pads and abandoned electrical connections. Sarah Thompson walked through the grounds on a cold February morning, carrying architectural drawings and a folder filled with insurance documents. The legal battles were finally nearing resolution, and the community was being forced to make a decision about the future of their rodeo tradition. "We've got 3 options," she explained to the small group of community leaders who had gathered for the meeting. "We can rebuild the arena with enhanced security features and resume the rodeo next year. We can sell the property to developers and use the money for other community projects. Or we can convert the space into a memorial park." Tommy Jackson, who had struggled with nightmares and guilt since the night of the attack, leaned heavily on his walking cane as he surveyed the abandoned grounds. At 46, the veteran rodeo clown was facing the possibility that his career was over, not because of his injured knee, but because he couldn't bring himself to return to the arena. "Feels wrong to just walk away from 50 years of tradition," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure I could handle watching another young rider get on a bull, even knowing that what happened here was deliberate." Dr. James Mitchell, now 68 and considering retirement, had spent months consulting with trauma specialists and veterinary experts to develop new safety protocols that could prevent another incident like the one that had devastated their community. "The science exists to detect the kind of compounds that Dr. Miller used," he reported. "Random testing of livestock, enhanced background checks for anyone with access to the animals, and improved communication between event organizers and law enforcement. We could make this the safest rodeo in Texas if we chose to continue." But the question of safety was complicated by the psychological trauma that affected not just the direct victims of the attack, but the entire community that had witnessed it. Mental health counselors had been working with dozens of families, helping children and adults process what they had experienced. Marcus Rodriguez had made a remarkable physical recovery, though he still walked with a slight limp and experienced occasional balance problems. More challenging was his ongoing struggle with what his doctors termed acute stress response. Sudden episodes of anxiety and panic that were triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. "I want to support whatever decision the community makes," he told the gathering, though his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned to carefully consider his words. "But I need to be honest about something. I don't think I'll ever feel comfortable around bulls again, and I'm not sure that's something I want to overcome." Carmen Delgado, who had completed her first semester at UT San Antonio's nursing program while maintaining her relationship with Marcus, had become an unofficial spokesperson for the families affected by the attack. "What Dr. Miller took from us wasn't just one night," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "He took our ability to feel safe in spaces where we should feel safe. He turned our traditions into sources of fear. If we're going to rebuild this rodeo, we need to rebuild it in a way that acknowledges what happened and honors the people who were hurt." Elena Vasquez, whose reporting had brought national attention to the attack and its aftermath, had continued to follow the story of Uvalde's recovery. Her articles had evolved from breaking news coverage to deeper examinations of how communities heal from deliberate acts of violence. As the sun set on the first Heritage Festival, the organizers gathered in the same arena where the attack had occurred 13 months earlier. The space looked completely different now. The bucking chutes had been removed, the rough stock pens had been converted to demonstration areas, and the focus had shifted from competition to education. Tommy Jackson stood in the center of the arena, leaning on his walking stick and looking around at the transformed space. "You know, I spent 20 years in this arena watching people risk their lives for 8 seconds of glory," he said to the small group. "Maybe what we're doing now is better. Maybe 8 seconds of education is worth more than 8 seconds of adrenaline." Dr. Mitchell nodded in agreement, though his expression remained thoughtful. "We've learned something important about community resilience this year. We've discovered that traditions don't have to remain unchanged to remain meaningful. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is adapt." The long-term impact of the Uvalde attack extended far beyond the borders of the small South Texas town. Rodeo organizations across the country had implemented new security protocols and animal testing procedures designed to prevent similar incidents. The case had also led to stricter controls on research involving behavioral modification compounds and enhanced background checks for people working with livestock at public events. Dr. Raymond Miller remained in federal prison, where he was receiving psychiatric treatment for the severe depression and obsessive thinking that had led to his attack on the Uvalde Rodeo. His case had become a subject of study for researchers investigating how grief and trauma can lead to violent behavior. But for the people of Uvalde, the most important legacy of their ordeal was the discovery that communities can survive deliberate attacks on their traditions and values. They had learned that healing doesn't require forgetting, and that transformation can honor the past while creating space for a different kind of future. Marcus Rodriguez, now 25 and working toward a degree in agricultural education, had become an advocate for mental health awareness in rural communities. His experience with trauma and recovery had given him insights that he shared through speaking engagements and support groups. "What happened to me wasn't random," he would tell audiences. "Someone made a deliberate decision to hurt people he didn't even know because he was drowning in his own pain. That taught me that we all have a responsibility to watch out for each other, to recognize when someone is struggling, and to offer help before that pain turns into something destructive." Carmen graduated from nursing school with honors and accepted a position at University Hospital in San Antonio, where she specialized in trauma care. Her experience with Marcus's recovery had taught her about the complex relationship between physical and emotional healing. "Medical training teaches you to treat injuries and illnesses," she would later reflect. "But what happened in Uvalde taught me that healing is about much more than fixing what's broken. It's about helping people rebuild their sense of safety and purpose after something terrible has happened to them." Sarah Thompson eventually left her position as event coordinator and opened a nonprofit organization focused on helping communities recover from mass casualty events. Her experience managing the aftermath of the Uvalde attack had taught her valuable lessons about crisis response and community healing. "Every community thinks it can't happen to them," she would explain to groups seeking her expertise. Uvalde was a safe, quiet town where the biggest excitement was usually high school football. But safety isn't about avoiding risk. It's about building the relationships and systems that help you respond effectively when bad things happen. The Uvalde Heritage Festival continued to grow in attendance and scope over the following years, eventually becoming a regional destination that attracted visitors from across South Texas. The event's emphasis on education and family participation created a model that was adopted by other communities seeking to modernize their own traditional events. But perhaps the most important legacy of the festival was the message it sent about community resilience and adaptation. Uvalde had faced a deliberate attack on one of its most cherished traditions, and rather than abandoning that tradition or pretending the attack hadn't happened, the community had found a way to transform itself. "We didn't let the bad guy win," Tommy Jackson would often say when asked about the community's recovery. "He wanted to destroy something beautiful, and instead we made it into something even better. That's not revenge, that's healing." If that story moved you, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button so you don't miss any of our stories. As the years passed, the physical scars from the attack faded, but the lessons learned remained embedded in the community's identity. Uvalde had discovered that traditions could evolve without losing their meaning, that safety and excitement weren't mutually exclusive, and that the strongest response to hate was the decision to build something better. The empty bucking chutes were eventually removed completely, replaced by a memorial garden where visitors could reflect on the events of that terrible night and the community's journey toward healing. A simple plaque honored Bill Hoffman's sacrifice and acknowledged the courage of everyone who had worked to save lives during and after the attack. But the real memorial was the festival itself, proof that communities could survive deliberate attacks on their values and traditions, and that the best response to those who would destroy what we love is to find new ways to celebrate it safely and inclusively. The story of Uvalde's recovery became a case study in crisis response and community resilience, but for the people who lived through it, the most important lesson was simpler: that healing is possible, that communities can choose to transform rather than simply endure, and that the decision to build something better is itself an act of defiance against those who would tear down what we hold dear. On quiet evenings, when the festival grounds were empty and the South Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead, you could still feel the echoes of what had been lost and what had been found. The laughter of children learning to ride, the pride of young people mastering traditional skills, and the satisfaction of a community that had chosen hope over fear. These were the sounds that now filled the space where terror had once reigned. Uvalde had learned that the most powerful response to violence isn't vengeance, but the decision to create something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken. In doing so, they had honored both their traditions and their healing, proving that communities can survive even deliberate attacks on their identity and values. The night that nobody expected had become the foundation for a future that nobody could have imagined, but that everyone could embrace with pride.